Hey guys, so I've made mention in the past episodes that one area I'm really interested in exploring is the interface between art and community. This is the first episode where I feel like I'm really going to be diving into it, and I'm doing it with Lincoln Cannon, who is the co-founder and former president and CEO of the Mormon Transhumanist Association, as well as the founder of the human enhancement company, Thrivous. Lincoln Cannon is one of the most brilliant and original thinkers I've ever had the chance of knowing in person. I credit him as being one of the most influential thinkers on my own way of viewing the world and providing me with what you might call the philosophical tools that kept me from going off the deep end when I decided to part ways with the faith of my birth. I hope you don't let this particular POV from a Mormon perspective hold you back from seeing the universals that we're exploring. As soon as you start talking about art and community, you need to start talking about religion, and that might require change in how you define religion. We're talking about it in this episode in a perspective rooted in Mormonism, but I think you'll find that the principles apply much more broadly, perhaps even if you don't think of yourself as being explicitly religious. This is also the first time I'm taking a leap and talking to someone whose job description is not artist, but if you pay close attention, I think you'll find that Lincoln has plenty to say about what it means to be an artist. So regardless, I'd love to hear about what you think about the discussion. Please let me know in the comments below. How to be an artist. Step 7. Provoking a communal strenuosity. With guest, Lincoln Cannon. I guess getting to some of the things I wanted to chat about today. I mean, I should preface by saying, we've known each other for quite a while, and I mean, I've been very interested in the work you've been doing, and you know the work of the MTA more broadly for a long time, and I've kind of been this person, I guess, kind of watching from the wings a little bit. Like, I've just been endlessly fascinated by a lot of the ideas and concepts being explored in the MTA. It makes up like a lot of my time that I spend like just thinking about stuff is very much influenced by that, I should say. I'm constantly like referring people to it as well, that people start talking about something kind of related to transhumanism or you know, the intersection between religion and transhumanism, and I'm always like, oh, you gotta check out the MTA. This stuff's super interesting, you know. But at the same time, I've always kind of been like, and you know, this probably has something to do with, I guess, my own ambitions in life or whatever. But I've always been a little bit like, I don't know if I want to like get more involved, you know, with the organization, even though technically I am a member. Yeah, so I'm kind of interested in maybe talking a little bit today, and then we can really go anywhere, but the things that I think I'm super interested about with the MTA, but also like things where I'm like, I'm interested. There's kind of tension areas as well where I've had questions where I've been like, well, I'm not sure about this or that, and so maybe we can talk about like a mix of some of those things.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
That sounds like fun.
I mean, the problem here is I think like there are a million questions I could ask you that I'm sure would be interesting and you'd have something interesting to say. So my real struggle is I kind of had a list of all these things I think would be interesting to ask you. And I'm trying to like figure out what can fit into this time, you know, and anyway, so we'll just see what happens and go from there. So I think, so one of the kind of broadly when I think about, like the MTA and kind of one of the big questions I have for the MTA and what sort of purpose it's supposed to play, you know, in the world. And I guess I should explain some for people. I'm going to include an intro to this, but for those that maybe didn't catch that or whatever, or if I don't get in the intro, the MTA stands for the Mormon Transhumanist Association. One of the questions I've had is like, okay, so here are these interesting ideas where you're merging kind of Mormon belief and mythology and theology with these transhumanist ideas and showing how they sync up together and support one another. And I've always had like kind of a difficult time seeing like, okay, well, how does that tell me about how I ought to act, you know, kind of moment to moment, day to day, you know? Like how does that inform kind of very basic morality? And so, I mean, one area that I do think gets to this is something like the new God argument, which I guess you can speak to, but I'm kind of interested first, how would you kind of address this idea of how does like transhumanism or even religious transhumanism, and in this case, specifically Mormonism, how does that inform how one ought to engage with the world or interact with the world?
Yeah, so there's maybe two different questions, maybe even three different questions there. First of all, how does transhumanism itself inform the way we should interact with the world? And first of all, I'd say that a proper understanding of transhumanism is one that incorporates both advocacy and ethical deliberation. So I'd define transhumanism as the advocacy for ethical use of technology to enhance human abilities.
Okay.
With emphasis on both advocacy and ethics. And so a lot of people think of transhumanism, they think of, here's some technology cheerleaders, and they think that technology is going to change humans to become what we might call superhumans, very long-lived, very healthy, maybe overcoming aging, perhaps even overcome death, increase in intelligence, and perhaps even have the capacity to increase in all kinds of other virtues through the application of technology to our physiology and our communities and such. But what people don't realize is that transhumanism at its heart is every bit as much concerned with the ethics of technological evolution as it is with the excitement and the technological optimism. So if you talk to a well-educated transhumanist and you say, hey, I have concerns that this brain-computer interfacing technology could be used in invasive ways to harm personal privacy and ultimately perhaps even take away a person's agency, things like that. A well-educated transhumanist will go, well, yeah, there are real risks. There are real concerns. And as a transhumanist, my position's not, those aren't serious things. To the contrary, it's, yes, those are serious things, but we can find ways to mitigate those risks.
Okay.
And we should, and we must, and we have to work together to figure out what those things are.
But that's the exact conversation we should be having is like, okay, what ought our relationship be to technology and how do we engage with it in the most optimally ethical way?
Yeah. And from a transhumanist perspective, that's done through an optimism that good things can come from it. Life-affirming and empowering things can come from it. But that doesn't mean that we should just be naive or apathetic about ethical issues. Those always need to be addressed along the way.
Yeah.
So there is in transhumanism not only an optimism about just the general potential of technology to improve and expand, enhance the human condition, but also an optimism towards our ability to figure out ethical ways of doing it.
Okay.
And then the other question was about, maybe religious transhumanism in particular, or as distinguished from general transhumanism, because of course most transhumanists are secular. And there are, of course, some transhumanists who are even anti-religious, although they're a minority.
Are they really that small of a subset?
They're a minority.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that they're like super small, but they're definitely a minority. Most transhumanists are not anti-religious. They're happy to work with whomever is interested in transhumanism. And
so even if they're very secular and maybe even describe themselves as atheists, they're usually pretty much like, yeah, that's fine as long as we can like work things out together.
Yeah, atheism isn't the challenge; it's anti-religiosity.
Yeah.
Which is, it occurs among atheists, but they're distinct phenomena, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You can be an atheist and still see value in religion, even for yourself, or at least for other people, even if you don't trust that God exists. So the question then is, what does religious transhumanism do or bring on a practical level? What practical difference does it make? And I'd suggest that a lot of transhumanism already functions as a misrecognized religion.
Oh, sure.
It fills a lot of the roles that religion fills for overtly or explicitly religious people,
Hmm.
but in ways that are kind of new and different. They've changed. But religion has always changed, right? Religion's not a new thing. It's a very ancient thing. It's as old as it's as old as history for
Sure.
one,
Yeah.
but older than that in ways that probably weren't recorded anywhere. And religion has evolved over that period of time to function in very diverse ways with very diverse sets of beliefs. And then modernly, contemporarily, of course, there are some dominant forms of religion, Christianity and Islam in particular, and then, some larger ones like Buddhism, Hinduism. But the diversity of religion does have some kind of common threads to it. And one of those common threads is what I would call the function of religion. And the function of religion is to provoke a communal strenuosity
Sure.
towards some set of shared goals.
Yeah, that's a great phrase, communal strenuosity.
Yeah, so shared, if it's not a shared thing, if it's not a communal
Absolutely,
thing, I would
yeah.
say it's probably not really religion, it's something else.
Hmm.
And if it's not about pushing people beyond ordinary levels of concern, if
Hmm.
it's not about pushing people to a strenuous level of concern for some set of values, some set of aesthetics, then it's also probably not religion. It's probably something else. But once it's communal and it's strenuous, then I would say that it's functioning as religion. And there's lots of aspects of human culture that are borderline religious.
Hmm.
Sports can be borderline religious. Um, Various expressions of art can be borderline religious. But you can start to tell when something becomes more than just borderline religious, when it's moving people to do things as a group
Yeah.
that, are not about maybe just financial compensation. They're taking risks as a group. They're standing up and making strong expressions about the shape of the world that they believe we ought to live in.
Sure.
And we see transhumanists doing that all the time. They even have their rituals,
Hmm.
you know, um, things that they do to, like, maybe their sacraments might be dietary supplements. Their their gods might be superhumanity. They might not think those gods exist yet, but they're still functioning as this motivating force of faith for a future that they
They certainly
aspire
have
to.
like a mythology, right? Kind of a shared sense of what the world is.
Yep. And so, already there, just transhumanism in itself, I wouldn't say transhumanism is necessarily religious, but for many transhumanists, it ends up functioning as religion.
Hmm.
And then for a subset of those people, it's actually explicitly religious. And so that's where you get to your Mormon transhumanists and your Christian transhumanists, and there's also many Buddhist transhumanists, and then people who maybe don't identify with any traditional religion, but who nonetheless consider transhumanism in some form to be their religion explicitly.
Hmm.
And what I think happens in these cases is that they've recognized this function of transhumanism, its religious function, its potential to have a religious function, and they've embraced that. And they've either embraced it in a way that says, okay, this is what motivates me to work with my, friends, my brothers and sisters, my family, my friends, my community, humanity. It motivates me to do the things that I believe are important, and I'm embracing it as such. And there are groups like, say, there's one called Terasem,
Hmm.
which is they're not associated with any traditional religion, but they consider themselves a sort of transhumanist religion. And then you've got others like Mormon and Christian transhumanists who look at our scriptures and at our authoritative traditions, and we see functional transhumanism all throughout our scriptures. And we say, well, transhumanism is a new word for a very ancient idea. This idea that humanity has greater potential than what we've currently expressed, and that we should be working toward that potential. And it shares, in the Christian tradition, there's these visions of a day to come when humanity will be transfigured, the dead will be resurrected, will become immortal. And a strong tradition in Christianity is called theosis, or deification, where we go on to become as Jesus exemplifies, as Christ exemplifies. We go on to become gods and saviors. And, many Christians will kind of interpret this more passively as something that God just does for us. But there are strong arguments to be made from the Bible that God isn't going to do for us what we can and should do for ourselves. James, for example, the Epistle of James, one of the apostles in the New Testament, he argues that faith without works is dead. It's not enough to just tell somebody who's hungry to be fed. It's not enough to tell somebody who's naked to be clothed. You actually have to feed and clothe these people. So you actually have to act on your faith. You have to have this faith that moves you to action, moves you to do practical things to realize the ends of your faith. And then, of course, you've got Jesus in the New Testament who says to his disciples that they're supposed to not only console the sad and heal the sick, but they're also supposed to raise the dead. That's one of the commandments he gives in the New Testament. And you've got Paul in the New Testament who says the day will come when we won't all die, but we'll be changed in the twinkling of an eye from mortality to immortality. And so there are strong arguments to be made from the Christian tradition that there's always been a functional transhumanism within it. And so Mormon and Christian transhumanists today recognize that and celebrate that and encourage that. And what we do is we say, hey, we feel like we are better Mormons and better Christians because of our understanding of transhumanism, because what transhumanists have done is they've contributed to a techno-scientific understanding of how we might better pursue our participation in these visions of the future of humanity that Christianity has given to us. So transhumanism ends up, being kind of helps us be yet more practical in our approach to our faith.
Sure.
So that's kind of a long answer.
No, that was good. Very thorough. What was I going to say about that? Well, one thing I think is kind of interesting that I see kind of an intersection. Well, first of all, I think it's very interesting that I think in some ways what transhumanism is doing is just kind of acknowledging something that was already going on. I mean, you talk about kind of this religion misrecognized idea, and I mean, I heard someone recently speak to this, saying something to the effect of like, a Catholic in the 1400s wouldn't have said they were religious. And, if you go back in history, these insular groups where religion formed, that they would have just taken it for granted. They wouldn't even really have thought of themselves as religious. And so part of this is just this process of kind of naming what is and being aware of what is. But in a certain sense, like transhumanism is just recognizing, I think, something that's been inherent about the progress of humanity for a very, very long time. I mean, it creates a very strong emphasis on tools, but I mean, certainly you can think of all sorts of intangible technologies as well as fitting into that, whether, they're different traditions or mythologies or rituals or whatever, like those are all different little nods and dials.
Psychosocial innovations.
Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of also interested in this idea of kind of taking ownership and responsibility for the effects of your religion. I think there's kind of a very interesting intersection with something like mysticism. You have this throughout religious history. You have these examples of people that are like, okay, I'm going back to the source. I mean, this is really the origin of Mormonism, is a young boy saying like, there's all these authorities out here telling me what is true, and I have to look at the Bible or whatever. They all have their different appeals to authority, and I'm going back to the source. I'm going to talk to God directly. And you have a long history of mysticism throughout lots of different traditions. I think there's kind of an interesting intersection there. This idea of I'm going to take responsibility for change, whether it's this outward change or this like inward connection. And I'm kind of curious, is like, how do you feel about this kind of mystical process, like this very personal, spiritual, whether it's a connection to God, or a secular person might see it as like, I don't know, a deeper understanding of the mind. How does that work into something like transhumanism?
Sure. First of all, let me say that the science behind personal spiritual practices like meditation, like prayers of gratitude, things along those lines and others that are similar, is really good. The science behind them, that you can go and you can find interesting results where scientists have gone in and looked at the effects of these practices and demonstrated that they help people live more peaceful, more productive, less stressed, more balanced lives. So that's the first thing I'd say, is that it's definitely worth looking at the science related to individual spiritual practices, and then trying to optimize our engagement in those practices in ways informed of that science. I think that's a useful thing to do. But then beyond that, on a more personal level, I'm a fan of what I'd call maybe spiritual or symbolic, or maybe mystical, or various, for lack of a better word, aesthetic approaches to life.
Mm-hmm.
I love it when I feel new things about the way the world is working, when I observe a natural setting that I've never observed before, or that strikes me with awe, or when I experience an act of kindness or love from a friend or family member, or maybe a stranger, that just kind of shocks me with its just openness. Those sorts of things I love to see and I love to experience, and I enjoy having conversations with friends who like to talk about the symbols that they observe or project in life, the patterns that they pull out of history, the patterns that they want to see go into the future, and how those inform their sense of purpose. I love all of this stuff, and I think it generally can be very valuable. And one note of caution I would sound is that if it ever moves you to become superstitious, rather than open to continuing to learn and respect the work of science, then you've probably made a mistake in how you're engaging in that aesthetic pursuit.
And
but if you manage to use the aesthetic pursuit in a way that continues to have a respect for science, then I see them as mutually reinforcing, where one can tell you more about how to do things effectively, and the other can inform your sense of purpose and motivation for doing it.
And how would you define something when you say something like superstitious?
Well, what comes to mind is there are strains in our society today of people who are very anti-science on various topics, and they think that science is a conspiracy. They don't understand how the scientific process works, or they might kind of use science the same way that some people use scriptures, where they'll pull out this or that aspect of it and dogmatize it and say science says this.
Sure, absolutely.
And really what they've done is they've just made a superstition out of one scientific paper or
Yeah.
one presumable interpretation of one scientific paper. Then there's people who will trust that the interpretation of their religion that they received from their parents or from people close to them in their lives as they were growing up is infallible and doesn't have room for any input from new experience, and that the God or the power that they've been taught of will overcome any challenge to their perception of its authority. And so they believe things that run strongly contrary to what we've learned through many centuries of hard work in the scientific disciplines.
Well,
So I would say superstition is that it's when you're just kind of not respecting the hard work that people have done to review each other's experience and to account for it through logic and reason and experimentation for many, many, many years.
It seems like there's something there that kind of says a little bit about rigidity. So it's not so much about maybe the things you believe so much as how okay you are with other people believing something different or being able to adapt those beliefs. Because I don't know, I feel like I do know quite a few people now that have access to all the same data that I have access to that still believe things that are, unprovable, for lack of a better word. They may believe in some sort of more mythological concept of God or something like that. But otherwise they're like, yeah, but I'm cool with you, like I'm cool with you believing what you want to believe, so, is that okay? Is it okay for people to quote unquote, like believe all the stuff is real, if you know what I mean?
I think that believing in unprovable things is perfectly fine as long as the practical consequences of that belief are not harming other people.
Yeah.
What I'm opposed to is believing in things that run contrary to pervasive evidence.
Yeah.
Like if you are going around denying human evolution today,
Mm-hmm.
contrary to pervasive evidence from multiple scientific fields that are independently verifying over and over again that humans have evolved, well, then you're disrespecting centuries of hard work by your fellow humans. It's not merely an epistemic failure, it's a charitable failure. You're putting your own perception, your own desire for the way the world works above the perceptions and desires of all of the rest of humanity. Or maybe all of the rest except your narrow sectarian group of people who want to deny that anybody else has had access to substantial information for explaining the way the world works. But if you're just believing in something that, doesn't run contrary to evidence, but against which there is no evidence, well, why not? If for example, somebody believes in a particular interpretation of God that motivates them to be happier and kinder, but they can't prove that their God actually has some characteristic that they care about and that they profess, I don't care. Maybe they'll be able to prove that someday. Or maybe it's the kind of thing that doesn't really lend itself to proof. It's more, there's some things that are just, I don't know, like Freud's psychology. People have often criticized Freud's psychology as being non-falsifiable, right?
Mm-hmm.
You either buy it or you don't. You can't really prove it in the end because there's too much wiggle room. And a lot of theologies are that way. They're not about being proven or disproven. They're about the way they motivate you or not. And at the end of the day, if these theologies are motivating people to behave in pro-social ways, in healthy ways, in ways that strengthen them as individuals and the rest of us as their community, more power to them.
Yeah.
Let's keep going. Let's still have our debates about, which religions might have yet better practical effects.
Mm-hmm.
Let's have that debate. But I'm not going to condemn them for engaging in a system of beliefs that makes them behave as better people.
So when it comes to religion and like the functions of religion as you defined it, are you basically a pragmatist? Are you kind of like, here's this machinery we call religion that we're still tinkering with, and whatever can get the optimal result, like, let's go with that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when it comes to epistemics, I'm a pragmatist in everything. I think that truth is ultimately what works. I think science is the primary example of demonstrating that truth is what works through experimentation, and that we should engage in that kind of experimentation wisely and educated ways based on history, not just in arbitrary ways. You don't want to just experiment randomly. You want to make informed hypotheses. But I think that we should engage pragmatically in all domains of knowledge, and that when things work better than other things, we should embrace those things that work better and help others embrace those things that work better. But we should be humble in the process too, and realize, hey, just because this thing worked better for me here and now doesn't mean that it'll work better for somebody else over there later.
Yeah.
So that's why peer review and replication matters, even when it comes to religion, which is why it's good to have kind of maybe a secular referee behind the religious groups that are vying for our attention, to make sure that we don't kill each other, but instead that we vie on a pro-social level for each other's faith, and that we kind of get a chance to work through, hey, what does have the most power as a faith for provoking us to participating in the creation of a better world for all of us.
I mean, do we need some sort of, I mean, whether recognized or not, I think we already have this to a degree, but some sort of meta religion that can kind of like incorporate the diverse beliefs we have. You know, clearly it cannot function the way other religions have. But do we need something that can incorporate that so we can still, as a group, serve this function of a religion? How did you say it? That we work together strenuously, you know, as a collective, and we can still believe lots of different things.
Yeah, I think we do have that to some extent. You know, there are people, Joseph Campbell, the monomyth idea, Julian Huxley with the perennial philosophy. These guys have argued that there are common strains throughout pretty much all human religious traditions and spiritual traditions, and that these common strains are that meta religion. And I think that's good that we recognize that, and that we build on common ground when possible. I also think that constructive competition is a good thing. I think that it would be a bad idea to try and encourage everybody to be the same and not to follow what inspires them, and to contend for it, right, in constructive ways, and champion it in constructive ways, because that's how evolution has always worked. And evolution works not only on a biological level, but also on social and technological levels. And religion is the product of social evolution, and religion is strong and powerful. It's robust for good and for evil because it's evolved to be so powerful.
Yeah.
And it's going to continue to evolve to be yet more powerful. And part of the way that works is through some, I hope, increasingly healthy forms of competition among different advocates.
Yeah, geez. It's like you're saying so much stuff. I have like different questions popping off, and I'm trying to like capture them before I forget them and they run off. So
yeah.
One question I had, you talked a little bit about humility, and I think one aspect of modernity that's really particular to right now, which I don't think it was absent in antiquity, but it's very much present nowadays, is you talked about humility. Like humility as far as like what we know, being open to change. I think that's something that's very new. And I think something that goes along with that, though, is that does need to be balanced out by confidence as well. Like you have to be able to act with a certain amount of confidence as well. And you can't be just flailing around unsure and, you know, being like, nothing means anything. Like, I don't know, like what's the best step to take? So I wonder if you could speak to how maybe we could balance humility and confidence, like in the era we're in right now.
Yeah, I love that you point out that those aren't opposites. They might sometimes feel like it's hard to have both, but they can also be complementary, as you've pointed out. We can be both humble and confident. How do we do that? Well, humility, humility is interesting. You mentioned that in some ways we've become more humble than in the past, and I think that's in part because we've kind of been forced to be more humble,
Mm-hmm.
not because we really chose it.
There's some reference to Mormon scripture there.
Yeah, when you're confronted with the internet and all of the information, when the internet makes the world smaller than ever before, and you see on the news more than ever before people who are so different than you are, you're kind of confronted with the realization that you don't know as much as you might have just naively or thought you would know if you weren't confronted with so many differences. And I think that's a big change. You go back a couple of centuries, go back even 1 century, and most people just simply weren't exposed to so many different ideas. And so, with that exposure comes a sense of, maybe I don't know enough about everybody. Now, there's some people who still choose to be really arrogant despite that, and they just like condemn the rest of the world, and they like block it out or whatever.
I have my
think
moments.
it's fewer of us than in the past.
Yeah.
As you pointed out. And then confidence. Confidence is trickier now in a sense, I would suggest, because of all of that diversity and because, modern science and modern academics have explored and deconstructed things that were not so broadly explored and deconstructed in the past, but they were explored. You go back to the Greek philosophers from 2,500 years ago, and they were already exploring some of these things that have become much more common to explore today. But I don't know what the rates of, like, say, depression and anxiety were 2,000 years ago. It would be interesting to compare. But it wouldn't surprise me if their rates were much lower than what we experience today because of how much kind of existential stress is placed on the modern mind. Our sense of purpose is challenged probably more, I would guess, than it was challenged 2,000 years ago. So when our sense of purpose is challenged, when our sense of identity is challenged, then, as you suggested, our feeling of confidence can also be challenged. And then humility can be turned from a virtue into a vice when it becomes something like fear or self-loathing, and that's no longer humility. That's just become a destructive force at that point. So we do need to be confident, and kind of key to confidence, I would argue, maybe the number one key to confidence is purpose. Purpose. If we can help people feel deeply a sense of purpose, they will do just about anything to pursue that purpose, whatever it is. If it's a deeply strenuously held purpose, a religious purpose, a functionally religious purpose, they'll do just about anything to pursue that. Their sense of confidence will be there, and they won't even have to ask themselves whether they're confident. It'll just kind of be there and abiding in them.
But that's something you got to have. You got to be able to like really feel that pretty intensely for that to be powerful enough to drive you forward, right? Or to be able to tie people together.
Yeah. And historically and presently, that is the primary strength of religion, right? The primary strength of religion is this aesthetic confidence, aesthetic purpose, tying a community together in that. The problem is that so many religions have become so dogmatic in their past that they've disconnected the aesthetics that give purpose from their epistemics of their accounts for why the world is the way it is, and they've contradicted science or they've ignored science, and they've created a tension between their epistemics and their purpose, and then that drives people crazy, and people have to choose, and they become either religious fundamentalists who reject the science, or they become anti-religious fundamentalists that reject the purpose, and both of those are unhealthy positions to be in.
I think it's funny hearing you talk about those extremes, because I've read exchanges you've had with both groups just ad nauseum, where you're just going back and forth with these different types of fundamentalists, and I think it's to your credit. One of the things that I admire about you is that you have these like ideas you work through, but you very much are you like put your money where your mouth is, like you have put in, the creation of the MTA, these discussions I've seen you had before where you're just going on and on with these groups. And sometimes it's just so clear the degree of their dogmatism is not going to allow them to like really engage with you, but it's admirable to watch you do that regardless, to make the attempt. So
watch me be a masochist.
Yeah. You have to suffer. You have to suffer for your art. Is a phrase I've heard before. So I'm kind of interested. One other interesting area of tension, the MTA and some of the ideas in the MTA have had a big influence on my thinking. But the other thing that's had a very profound influence on the way I see the world within the last few years has been Nassim Taleb's work, as particularly Anti-Fragile. And it's enough of a thing that like I have kind of like reluctantly call myself like a disciple of Nassim Taleb, just because I find myself referencing it so often that I'm just like, okay, I just have to like admit like what I am, even though his like way of engaging with people interpersonally is not necessarily the way I want to model myself. But I kind of find his ideas really interesting because I feel like in some ways they are at the core about addressing the issues that transhumanism is about. Like you talk about the ethics of using technology, and that's like, I think explicitly what his work is really about, is like what ought our relationship to technology to be, what should it be? And he has his own very particular concept about how we ought to engage with technology. And so I think particularly as it comes to something like religious transhumanism, there is this way where it feels like it's a good fit, but at the same time, I mean, and I don't know, have you read Anti-Fragile? I'm not sure.
I've not, unfortunately. Okay. I've heard good things about it.
Okay. Well, there is one part where he explicitly like just trashes on Ray Kurzweil in Anti-Fragile. It's only like a sentence, but like he literally says like, that guy is like the exact opposite of the type of person I want to be. So there's kind of a tension in the sense that he's not quite so much, he doesn't like that kind of popular science relationship to technology, as far as like, let's get really excited about technology. He's kind of more about the caution or kind of having a right mix of caution and investment, if that makes sense. So I don't know if it's a little bit of an ambush, if depending on where you are of the ideas, but I wonder if that's something you'd be interested in responding to.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. I'm not familiar with his ideas in particular. It would be interesting to hear more about why he dislikes Ray Kurzweil. Maybe he
by the way, he
people.
dislikes lots of people, so it could just be his personality. But he kind of gets in fights with almost everyone out there. But anyway,
okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I'll chalk it up to that then. Ray Kurzweil is actually a really likable guy, and very optimistic, and not at all stupid about risks. You ask him about risks, he'll acknowledge them. They're real, but he's also trying to give people hope and purpose, and that's a valuable contribution, I think. But on the topic of anti-fragility, I think it's a very important concept. And I would even go so far as to say that an important expression of anti-fragility would be decentralized power and cooperation among humans in our kind of techno-human civilization. And I would say that our future depends utterly on that cooperation. And let me explain why. So if you look historically at the progress of human civilization, we started out with simple tools that presented simple risks, and we learned how to cooperate to manage those risks. And because we learned how to cooperate to manage those risks, human civilization stuck around long enough to come up with new and better tools. And now we didn't always use these tools right? We used them wrong often as well, but we used them right enough to survive and to go a little bit longer and to develop a little bit better tools. And that process has repeated itself, but in the most recent centuries, we've started to develop tools that have the power to destroy human civilization at large, such as nuclear weapons, or perhaps some of the effects of global climate change. And we're coming up with new technologies that may and likely will be even more dangerous than the horrors that we've imagined possible because of nuclear weapons. How are we going to manage this? Well, though it's going to be hard, and it's going to be harder than with nuclear weapons, because these new weapons of the future are going to be less expensive and smaller and more decentralized than the weapons of the past. So you'll have small terrorist groups, perhaps, that could use a suitcase-sized weapon that is more dangerous than a large nuclear bomb that is controlled by a centralized government. I suspect the only way that we will manage to survive this decentralization of technological power is if we simultaneously continue to increase in our willingness to cooperate. And if you kind of chart that willingness to cooperate and the necessity of cooperation into the future as our technological power continues to increase and continues to decentralizing be a key here. I think that what you'll see is that cooperation will become increasingly immersive and pervasive, and I would argue that cooperation at its limits is indistinguishable from compassion. So another challenge here is that today we have large centralized governments with a lot of control over various aspects of our lives. And we also have large centralized corporations that are vying with governments for the level of power that they have over our lives. Unfortunately, when those large centralized powers hiccup or encounter a problem, there's major fallout.
That's a nice way to say it. Yeah.
Yeah, hiccup's a nice way to say it. And that fallout harms lots of people or causes, problems that none of us enjoy dealing with. So what we have is increasing realization that centralized powers can't handle effectively some of the risks that we're facing today. So there's incentive to try and find ways to decentralize those powers. And if we don't follow those incentives, we might be forced, because a centralized power might collapse or be severely weakened and have cascading consequences that will then increase the incentive subsequently. And I'd rather learn before rather than after. But hey, it takes what it takes. Anyway, there's all these pressures in our need to manage technological change, in our need to overcome the risks of excessive centralization, that are moving us towards an increased need for decentralized cooperation. And I think that that's a good thing. And I think that if we don't move in that direction, if we don't increase in our willingness to cooperate and our ability to cooperate in a broader, more decentralized way, that increasingly bad things will happen that will either destroy our civilization or set us back substantially until we figure it out.
Yeah, either of those scenarios is not a pretty scenario. It's kind of hard not to look at the world and see the way most of it runs and not feel like it's going to take nothing less than like some sort of Mad Max to get us on the right path. Even though, hopefully COVID, with all the disruption COVID has caused, hopefully it's one of these things that can be kind of the minimum disruption necessary to get people to start getting on the right track a little bit with some of the choices they make.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the silver lining of COVID-19, right?
Yeah.
It's a chance for us to rethink a lot of things that were more fragile and more centralized than we would like, and come up with ways to make them anti-fragile, which, in my understanding, again, I can't comment particularly on the author you referenced, but in general, this sense that we can make systems that become more robust through the challenges that they face, rather than less robust for the challenges that they face.
Yeah.
The challenge actually makes certain kinds of systems
better
because of the challenge. And those tend to be decentralized systems.
Yeah, absolutely. This kind of gets back to this question of like, how does this affect maybe an individual choice, or an individual's choice day to day? I think there's this kind of this feeling that I feel often where I feel like, okay, there's this direction that I see that the world needs to go in. At the same time, I feel like there's a limit to how much I can affect that happening. There's a lot of the stuff that's just out of my hands. Like kind of this, the thing that I kind of get caught up quite a bit is like, national elections, the hope that people get put into national elections, that's going to like fix things, right. But also this idea,
too little, too late.
Yeah, but also this idea that somehow I'm going to affect that outcome. Like the outcome is already, I feel like it's already written, and there's not much I can do about it. So there's this question: if we have this outcome we want, where we want to see humanity survive our own destructive potential, how does that inform my individual decisions, and how can I be empowered, that I can have some sort of confidence in some sort of decisions that's going to drive me forward in a meaningful way?
I think there's an easy answer to this,
okay,
but very few people will believe it enough to really act on it.
Okay.
And that is that you have to start acting a lot sooner and a lot more consistently. And do the small things over and over and over again for a long period of time. It's the idea of having a lever long enough, you can change the future with it, right?
Yeah.
If you wait until the day of the election to try and change who's going to become president of the United States, you have waited too long, and your vote is too little.
Yeah.
But if you start now working on influencing who will be the president of the United States in, I don't know, maybe 4, 8, 12, 20, 50 years,
yeah,
you can do that today.
Yeah.
If you have the motivation, the focus, the consistency to work at making small things happen over and over again, they build up, and big things are the consequences. So, great example of this, I think, from something that you and I are both familiar with, is the MTA. When the founders of the MTA first got together, we thought, hey, wouldn't it be great if there was this group of Mormons who advocated that science and technology are the friends of religion, and that humanity should use science and technology to achieve the visions of religion, and that immortality and resurrection should be not just metaphorical things, but literal things that we could be working on together. Wouldn't that be awesome if a group like that existed?
Yeah.
And we didn't just get on the internet and look and say, oh, there is not one. Oh, well, too bad.
Yeah.
No, we sat down and we started making a group.
Yeah.
And it was just 14 people initially, and now today there's about 1,000 members, nearly 1,000 members of the MTA. Now, it's not going to take over the world anytime soon. But the difference that the MTA is making now is very, much more substantial than it was when we founded it in 2006. And the influence that it has today is going to be equally, effective on the future 10, 20, 30 years from now, but even at a larger scale than over the 15 years that we've already seen.
Yeah.
So, if you want to change religious discourse in the world tomorrow, you've got to start yesterday.
Yeah.
And it can really happen. Religious transhumanism is a real thing. We're interviewed by some of the largest magazines and newspapers in the world today. People are doing documentaries on us.
Oh, it's
that
very
would
much
not have happened if we if we didn't make decisions 15 years ago that, hey, we're going to make this a thing.
It's interesting. I can remember kind of watching, again, me watching from the sidelines and not really being involved, but watching that process, seeing those initial discussions with the broader transhumanist community, and the initial responses were kind of maybe amusement at first, or kind of confusion, but like you say, now it's become a very established part of that community. It's definitely due to work, like you said, consistent small things over a long period of time. I think kind of one thing that's really interesting about this approach you are mentioning as well is, it's very simple, that the best the best response to centralization is decentralization. And that doesn't just mean like, let's lobby our government for decentralization. It means kind of just like actively creating small groups of people with shared goals and a shared vision. We kind of have this thing where I think as far as if we're going to call activism changing the world, people are very, very focused on themselves individually, and they're very focused on like national government, and they don't see that there's like a huge amount of space between those things,
don't wait for your government to make the change. Who was it that said it? Be the change. Was that Gandhi? I don't know who it was.
Yeah. But be the change on a smaller scale than just. I mean, you do have to start with yourself. Like there's the whole like Jordan Peterson thing, like clean your room. I think that's probably pretty excellent, like way more excellent advice than people like give him credit for. But at some point, you have to have like a club or whatever some sort of de facto religious group that's going to be working together towards some sort of common goal.
Yeah, and the revolutions that are coming, they're not going to, some of them will come from our governments, maybe, hopefully. Most of them won't.
Mm-hmm.
Like, probably, if I had to predict where the biggest governing revolution of the future will come from, I would say it's going to come from blockchain technologies and somehow associating a set of aesthetics, a set of values with blockchain technologies.
Yeah.
So we enable with new form of technology some kind of inspiration around a new form of governance. It's not enough just to have the tech. It's not enough just to have the values. It's when the two merge together that we can create something really new and revolutionary.
Yeah.
And I think that that's coming. I think that new forms of governance are coming. They will be far more scalable than hopes from the past. Libertarians have always wanted a more decentralized world, but it was mostly pie in the sky, right? The best place to go see the results of historic libertarian efforts is in Africa, and nobody wants to live there that's lived in the developed world. Well, I take that back. Some people do. My son just got home from a mission to Africa, and he loved being there. But he's happy to be back, though, right?
Yeah.
And there's good reason for that. There's the world is just more stable in the West, or in the developed world, I should say. There's parts of the East too now, but we're never going to get to those hopes of a more decentralized, less oppressive future just by hoping for them, just by doing the same kinds of things that we've done for centuries.
Yeah.
We need new tools. We need new governing tools. The vote is not a sufficient governing tool for the distant future.
Yeah.
It was a great invention when we came up with the vote. Wonderful invention. But it's not enough anymore. The caucus, the House of Representatives or Parliament, these are all technologies, social innovations that have been very powerful in transforming our governance. But I think we've reached peak Republican democracy. I think so.
Yeah.
I think and that's not a bad thing. We've done amazing things with it. I love the United States of America. I'm a big fan, But I think that to scale farther, to do something that we've never done before, is going to take new tools and new social innovations, and they'll come.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. I don't know if you're familiar with like any of Ken Wilber's concepts, but he has these like, as he looks at human development, he kind of talks about the idea that the next level like transcends and includes the previous level. Do you think it's going to be something like that? Whatever comes next will sometimes have to transcend, but also include democracy and capitalism and all these other things that have gotten us to where we are? Or is it more going to be something that's going to have to emerge that's going to be more novel than those other things?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of Wilbur. He's probably right. And, when we look at the landscape of governance today, we still have monarchies. We just call them dictatorships now, or we call them constitutional monarchies, like in the UK, right? So those haven't gone away. It's just that democracy has become more prominent. But even democracy, it's not really what we have. It's more like Republican democracy, right? Where, there's limited representation. It's not...
Still quite a bit of power held by like a small group of elites, right?
Right. And that's for scale reasons, right? That's for scale purposes. We simply could not effectively scale, nor would it be moral to scale up, pure democracy in its traditional form. There's all kinds of concerns with tyranny of the majority and things like that, right? So we just couldn't do some things historically that we've aspired to in kind of an ideological sense that maybe new technologies will enable us to pursue more effectively and more ethically.
Yeah.
And no, to more explicitly answer your question, no, I don't think that will like suddenly displace everything we've ever done before. I do think it will be an evolution, but evolution is not always smooth. It has fits and starts, and there really are revolutions in even biological evolution. There's times when evolutions move apparently much faster than other times. And I think that we'll see that in governance at some point. I think, we've seen that with democracy. It's a relatively novel form of governance, but I think we'll see things like that come along over the next decades. I would say short of centuries. I think we're due for changes sooner than that, where
we kind of don't have any other option.
Yeah, where we'll see a lot of change pretty quick, but we'll figure out ways of integrating what currently exists, hopefully as constructively as possible.
So, should most people have hope that the future is going to be better in some way?
Yes, it's your moral obligation.
Good. Well, I mean,
even if you think it's probabilistically unlikely, you should still hope, and you should work against those probabilities. If you see only a small probability that the future is bright and beautiful for all of humanity, you should latch onto that and pursue that with your entire heart.
Okay, I'm in this a little bit because this is a real idea I really like. And am I right that this is kind of one of the conclusions that comes out of the New God argument? Is that fair to say?
The primary assumption of the New God argument.
Oh, okay.
It's called the faith assumption.
I got it backwards then, but
you can argue for it on moral and pragmatic grounds, right? If you're running full tilt being chased by a moose in the mountains and you come to a cliff and 15 feet of open air over a 1,000-foot drop off, on the other side of that 15 feet is another like ledge of a mountain. And if you could only get to that, you would escape the moose that's chasing you. What's the best thing to do when you're running full tilt towards the edge of that cliff? To doubt your ability to jump those 15 feet? Or to say, you know what? I have to jump those 15 feet.
Yeah.
You trust in, even if it's a small probability, because trusting in the small probability increases that small probability, because we have a way of creating truth to some extent. We can't create truth arbitrarily, but there's an important kind of truth that's created. And we have a moral obligation and a practical obligation to use our capacities as best we can to create the best kinds of truths that we can, to the extent that we have that power. And that's actually the first assumption of the New God argument, as you pointed out. It's trust that humanity will not go extinct, not become extinct before evolving into superhumanity. So no matter how many difficult things you think we might have to traverse to get there, to whatever you imagine superhumanity to be, that great and beautiful, wonderful future for all of us, the first assumption of the new God argument that we make on practical and moral grounds is that we will survive long enough to get there. And then we look at what the probable ramifications of that would be.
Okay. So I was kind of getting it backwards. And there's a different set of arguments that takes you to that first assumption.
Yeah, that first assumption is kind of a secular assumption, and the ultimate expression of the new God argument, of course, is talking about how some secular assumptions lead to a practical faith in God, ultimately. But that first assumption is, it's purely secular. It's this idea that we're going to trust on practical and moral grounds that humanity will not become extinct before evolving into superhumanity.
Yeah, which by the way, that's one thing I would highly recommend other people check out. I think New God argument is some really fascinating stuff. One thing I think is kind of interesting. I know a lot of people that have maybe have like kind of a fatalistic view of the future and kind of have this idea of like, even literally, I'm not going to have children because I don't think it's morally right to bring a child into like a world that could potentially be, so full of suffering and things like that. I think particularly people that may deal with depression or have kind of a nihilistic view on things, it's very easy to say like, yeah, it's not justified for there to be another generation.
Right. Yeah. And this is very definitely an aesthetic preference, right? How can you argue? There is no argument against nihilism.
Exactly.
Logic doesn't get you out of there. What gets you out of nihilism is purpose, faith.
Yeah. And it really comes down to, if you think life is worth living, that to me, that's enough justification to say that the next generation is worth living,
Yeah.
So, and I think there's a lot of people that are just kind of like waiting to see, and that may have more to do with being in a place where we do have a lack of purpose for a lot of people. And so because they are lacking purpose, they don't see the justification because they probably feel pretty shitty in their own lives. They're less willing to see that it could be better in the next generation.
For sure. That's a huge challenge today. And I would suggest to somebody who's feeling that way to take a hard look at religious transhumanism. I've seen it transform the lives of many people. Very literally, totally transformative. That's
cool. So you've actually seen kind of in a very, what's the word I'm trying to, almost an evangelical way. That's not the right word, but have there been people that you've introduced to it that have just been kind of curious, like, oh, okay, this is interesting, that may have been kind of more nihilistic or maybe atheist or not, and come out of it kind of with a different viewpoint or purpose in the world?
Yeah, it's happened regularly. Not a rare thing. There have been people who have regained faith that they lost from their childhood. There are people who have never been religious who have become religious. There are people who were atheists who have become theists, and we're talking about theists who still believe in science. I see changes like this regularly among people who become familiar with and start to engage in religious transhumanism.
Well, I have to be honest that it's had a huge impact on my life as well. So, when I grew up LDS Mormon and I decided to leave, but I feel like having that connection with Mormon transhumanism was able to kind of keep me from going to a place that might have been a little bit more nihilistic or, even just dogmatizing science. Potentially. So I've seen it in my own life. So I got to give props for that as well, and kind of give some appreciation for that as well. So
yeah, and your experience that you're describing, as you're probably aware, is similar to the experience of a significant number of other religious transhumanists and Mormon transhumanists. It's it does have the ability to genuinely support and create a sense of purpose.
Yeah. Well, I think, I probably should wrap this up here pretty soon, but, I think that what you're doing, what you've done with the MTA and kind of that work, and that you're still obviously thinking through things, I don't know, my sense is that this plays a very critical role in kind of figuring out these problems we've got ahead of us as humanity, as a human species. So I just feel like very lucky to have had a chance to be introduced to it, and I'm super grateful for you taking some time to come chat with me about this stuff. So
absolutely, I appreciate the opportunity, Brandon. It's been a total pleasure both speaking now and, of course, the opportunities we've had to speak and interact over the years.
Awesome. Hey, thanks for being here, and hopefully we can do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Brandon.
You've been listening to How to Be an Artist. To support this podcast, you can go to patreon.com/H2BNA.